Welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting entitled Operation Ibn Sina, Carrying the Flag of a New World Paradigm of Peace Through Development. In a world tortured by real problems such as species-threatening pandemics, civilization-destroying warfare, globalized criminal surveillance of populations, soul-destroying drug epidemics, and money-grubbing scams like global warming, where can a young person, for example, just starting out in life, find prospects for optimism? Where do any of us find prospects for optimism? Why does life matter? Why should life matter? Is it really true that each human life is a potential source of good? At this time of year, during a Christmas season, that is the topic that is ostensibly on the minds of those that are or consider themselves to be Christians or followers of Christian faith, or for that matter, the Judaic or Islamic faith. But is there a way to know whether or not life is good? Is there a way to know what the good is?
What is the good? The good is the power of mind to recognize a principle of reason as the lawful ordering of the entire universe. To recognize that a process of development is associated with this, and to recognize that the continuation and acceleration of the takeover of the personality by elaborated reason is the good. The elevation of the moral condition of mankind in correspondence with this principle and in actions congruent with that principle is the good. Such was the principle of Solon at Athens. Such was the principle of Platonic Academy, the concept of the Republic, and such were the principles of the founding of the modern European Republic by the writings of St. Augustine. That is the good. And the Republic is the only natural condition of mankind. And it was proven by Dante and his followers that the only natural form of republic is a totally sovereign nation state, not subject to the IMF or the World Bank or UNO. A sovereign nation state, a republic which is based upon the employment of a literate form of common language by its citizens. A literate form of language which imparts to those citizens, as in the words of Shelley, the power of imparting and receiving profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. Conceptions organized in the form of reason. The form of reason as exemplified by the Socrates of Plato's dialogues. That is the natural condition of mankind. All other features of a natural condition of mankind pertain to the development of the republic and the citizen rather than as to its form and its end.
That was economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, who founded the Manhattan Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization, which you're right now watching. He founded it 6 years ago. He passed away in February of 2019. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Project meeting entitled Operation Ibn Sina, Carrying the Flag of a New World Paradigm of Peace Through Economic Development. As some of you should know, or anyone who is familiar with our platform here knows, we've been organizing together with the Schiller Institute something called the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. And there's been a very specific intervention into the Afghanistan theater that we have talked of in Southwest Asia as well, called Operation Ibn Sina, named after the great world-renowned physician, philosopher, and polymath, as they sometimes call it, Ibn Sina, who lived between the years of 980 through 1037 AD. This Operation Ibn Sina is a military strategic as well as a philosophical alternative to the lethal geopolitics of Southwest Asia and the various forms of warfighting, sometimes hot war, sometimes cold war. And the idea is to transform the present and clearly failing complex of credible policy options, so to speak, in order to secure not only some sort of human survival in that area, but even prosperity. Now, in an interview, which I think was yesterday with National Public Radio, World Food Program head David Beasley, just back from Kabul, Afghanistan, said of that situation that, quote, the international community has frozen all the assets that the country would normally have, referring particularly to the money, the $9.8 billion in the banking system. He described Afghanistan as being a kind of hell on earth and called on the world to make these funds available, and for that matter, to get involved in a full-scale recovery project for that, not only for Afghanistan, but for other areas of the world as well. Mr. Beasley has made the point that tens of millions face the prospect of starvation over the coming weeks and months through no necessary reason. Importantly, there's a conference that's going on called the Organization of Islamic Countries, or Islamic Conference. And it's meeting from December 17th through 19th this weekend. They were formed in 1969. They have 57 members representing 1.8 billion people on the planet. There's a potential for this conference to conclude with a broad aid and reconstruction development proposal for Afghanistan, which that nation sorely needs. Schiller Institute founder Helga Sepp LaRouche, as well as Schiller Institute activist Hussein Askari, appeared just this past weekend on Pakistan PTV World's coverage of the OIC ministerial meeting on Friday. Helga denounced the failure so far of the transatlantic world to take human responsibility for the situation it created in Afghanistan. After all, the United States was there for 2 full decades. She decried the withholding of billions of dollars of the Afghani people's funds as shameful. And we talked there about Operation Ibn Sina, which is a path forward to create a health and development program for Afghanistan and also for the world as a whole. She was requesting that that proposal might be incorporated by the OIC in its final resolutions and appeal to the entire world to choose the side of humanity over barbarism. Then this morning on Pakistan TV, there was a dialogue held again to discuss the urgency of the crisis in Afghanistan. And Harley Schlanger, who's often been here on this program and it represents Executive Intelligence Review, was included in the panel discussion. What he did was outline a 3-step program. Number 1, unfreeze the funds. Number 2, emergency aid, which can certainly be extended after the trillions of dollars that were expended there by the United States and Europe for the war machine, and to look to get the necessary logistical and related support in for that. And then the third point was that you have to go to a long-term approach for full economic development. For both emergency humanitarian aid and long-term development, you have to go with what is referred to as Operation Ibn Sina. And what this is referring to is the idea of not merely talking about some form of economic aid, but a meeting of cultures, a dialogue of cultures, being able to personify the humanity of people rather than thinking of them as merely beasts. Now, the lethal implications of the other method, which is the general geopolitics that we've seen and which has been being discussed in many other ways that we're about to begin to talk about, whether we're talking about the Ukraine-Russia so-called confrontation, or we're talking about the bellicose beating of drums by people like Senator Wicker from Mississippi, up to including talking about the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. You know, that's the kind of world is just sort of the inferno of world diplomacy. That's the world that people like George Herbert Walker Bush temporarily, occupied as a proxy for the old imperial interests of the British Empire or the East India Company, or perhaps HSBC Bank, the leading drug bank in the world. an old enemy of Lyndon LaRouche, which we've been fighting for over 40 years, which we refer to as Dope Incorporated. That's their world, the world of the inferno. And the very real danger of thermonuclear war resulting from this kind of lethal geopolitics is only checked by calm, intelligent, personal leadership. Vladimir Putin expressed that kind of leadership in action in a recent interview.
So let's move on to your summit with President Biden. The context for the summit is that he is meeting with the G7, a group that you used to belong to, with NATO, with European leaders. President Biden has defined his first trip to Europe as, quote, about rallying the world's democracies. He views you as a leader of autocrats who is determined to undermine the liberal democratic order. Is that true?
Well, I don't know. Somebody serves under this kind of sauce. Somebody looks at the development of the situation and at yours truly in a different manner. All of this is being offered to the public in a way that is found to be expedient for the ruling circles of a certain country. The fact that President Biden has been meeting up with his allies, there is nothing unusual about it. There's nothing unusual about the G7. We know what G7 is. I've been there on numerous occasions. I know what the values are in that forum. When people get together and discuss something, it's always good. It's better than not to get together and not to discuss, because even in the context of G7, there are matters that require ongoing attention and consideration, because there may be some differences. There may be differences in assessments of international events, and very well, let them get together and discuss it. As far as NATO, I have said on many occasions, this is a Cold War relic. It's something that was born in the Cold War era. I'm not sure why it still continues to exist. There was some talk about it being reformed. Now it has been kind of forgotten. We presume that it is a military organization. It is an ally of the United States. Time and again, it makes sense to meet up with your allies, although I can have an idea of how the discussion goes on. There clearly everything is decided by consensus. However, there is just one opinion that is correct, whereas the other opinions are not quite that right, putting it in careful terms. Well, there we go. Allies are getting together. What's so unusual about it? I don't see anything unusual about it. As a matter of fact, it's a sign of respect to the U.S. allies before a summit between the U.S. and Russian presidents. Probably it is being suggested as an attempt and desire to find out their opinion on the key issues of the agenda, including those issues that President Biden and I will discuss. However, I'm inclined to think that despite all of these niceties, the United States, as far as their relationship with Russia, will be promoting what they consider important and necessary for themselves, above all for themselves, in their economic and military interests. However, to hear out what their allies have to say about this is probably something that always makes sense. This is a working process.
It should be noted that the actual military strategic situation that's today being described as, quote, the crisis on the Ukrainian border involving Russia is a crisis on the Russian border as well. The question is, how is that seen internally to Russia? Putin himself commented in a recent interview after some discussion by a commentator.
NATO expansion, Murat, expanded on as well by Vladimir Putin in the interview.
Vladimir Putin says that now the argument for NATO expansion, strengthening NATO, is Russia's aggressive behavior. But Vladimir Putin said, look at the decades gone, the last 2 decades. There were 2 cycles of NATO expansion while Russia and the West, while Russia and NATO were friends, while they were friendly with each other. And here Vladimir Putin also remembered Cuba, because Cuba, when the Soviet Union stationed nuclear weapons there, was a huge red line for the United States. Russia was eventually removed those nuclear weapons. But somehow, when the United States and NATO encroach on Russia closer and closer and closer to Russia's borders, somehow they don't see that as being of concern to Russia. But Vladimir Putin says that it is.
As for NATO's expansion and its infrastructure getting closer to Russia's borders, it's an extremely important issue for the security of all Russians and for our country. It has a practical significance for us. Why is that? When Poland and Romania became NATO member states, they quickly agreed to America's missile defense systems being stationed on their territory. But the launch pads used for those systems can also be used for offensive weaponry, which can reach central Russia, including Moscow, within a very short time frame, 15 minutes. Imagine if Ukraine were to become a NATO member. It would then take 7 to 10 minutes if such missiles were stationed, say near Kharkov or Dnipropetrovsk, to reach Moscow. Is that a red line for us or not?
Look, Russia has been attacked enough times to, for nuclear weapons and for arms of an international coalition, encroaching, moving closer and closer to Russia to start ringing alarm bells. And on this note, Vladimir Putin also talked about Ukraine's prospects of joining NATO, obsession, really, objectively speaking, in the last several years. Here, he remarked on one incident several days ago when Biden and the Ukrainian president spoke by phone. They issued very different press statements at the end. Biden said that they talked about corruption and guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity. And the Ukrainians claim that they also, Joe Biden also said that he was in support of offering Ukraine a roadmap to join NATO. The Americans pressed the Ukrainians to remove that and said, we said nothing of the sort. And that incident caused a lot of jokes in Russia, in expert circles, in the press. Vladimir Putin said that he, for one, wasn't laughing, because we don't know what was in that phone call. And the behavior of Ukraine and NATO is such that it suggests that Ukraine potentially could be offered membership in NATO. So Vladimir Putin says that those are a red line for Russia. That NATO infrastructure, and perhaps even nuclear weapons moving into Ukraine for Russia, that is an absolute red line.
Astute, if hostile, British commentators have even pointed out that there are contradictions in the recent Cold War narrative itself about the so-called Russian expansionism. Here's an example, which I'm going to put up on your screen. It's from James Meek, and this is from the London Review of Books. It's about to come out, but some of us have advanced copies. He says, let's suppose there is evidence for this, he contends, that Gazprom, the Russian state gas company, deliberately left its gas storage facilities in Germany half full in the run-up to winter, in order to send gas prices soaring and to remind Europe how dependent it is on Russian gas for heat and power. One theory is that Putin did it to pressure Brussels and Berlin into allowing the switch on of the newly built pipeline Nord Stream 2, which carries Russia's gas west. But if you wanted to demonstrate Russia's liability as a source of energy at a time when the haters are out to get fossil fuels, how much sense does it make to behave like an untrustworthy bully to your best customers? And how would that fit in with the migrant plan? How would that mesh with the idea that Putin is about to reinvade Ukraine? Without the new pipeline, Ukrainian transit is essential for Russian gas supplies to Europe at times of high demand. And the existence of Nord Stream 2 would certainly make it easier for Russia to launch an attack in the crude sense that it could cut off the gas supply to Ukraine in the middle of winter and still keep the good folk of Bavaria and Milan warm while they watch the war on TV. But perhaps Europeans aren't quite as happy to burn their ideals for heat as this scenario assumes. If a new invasion sped up Germany's transition from gas, new invasion by Russia of Ukraine, strengthened European resolve to step away from its dependence on Russian energy and made Russia still more of a pariah in Europe than it already is, how would that be in Russia's national interest or Putin's? And we're going to show you a map of the area here. So this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline they're talking about. And as you can see, there's Russia. The yellow line is Nord Stream 1 that's already built. It's already operational. And that bypasses the normal routes of Ukraine. I think we have a map also of Ukraine and Russia. Also, yeah. Now, so these are the normal route where you see Russia there in the pink color. Then you see Belarus and then Ukraine. I don't know if you can point that out on the map for people or not, but it's in the yellow, and you see the gas pipelines that go through. Nord Stream, as you can see there, just underneath Sweden and Finland, bypasses all of that. It goes through the water there, as you can see, the Baltic and so on. And what you're seeing is that would allow Russia to not have to worry about Ukraine. And so there are all these different theories about the different things that the nefarious Vladimir Putin is doing, but none of them really seem to amount to much. Now, this week, extremely important discussions have been held by Vladimir Putin and by President Xi Jinping of China. An analysis of this process is virtually unavailable or unrecognizable when it comes to truth, anyway, in the transatlantic media. And because of the role of this organization historically and particularly recently, and our responsibility to get the truth to the American people, we want to turn now to two of my colleagues to discuss this. They are Richard Black, who does a lot of our work at the United Nations and otherwise is a writer for Executive Intelligence Review, and Bill Jones, who is a China desk man for EIR as well. We're going to start with Richard, and then we're going to go to Bill. So, Richard?
Thank you, Dennis. Let me begin essentially by urging all of you, our viewers, to mobilize with us in the Schiller Institute to defeat what is an ongoing buildup for nuclear war. A nuclear war by the US and NATO against Russia or against China. And what that means is go to the website of the Schiller Institute, download our videos, download our leaflets, mobilize everything you can on social media. The word has to be gotten out far and wide what the actual danger is. Now, this last week and a half, it became very clear that the mad war party in London and in Washington is calling for war, calling for nuclear war. On the very day that President Putin and Biden were speaking, the second-ranking highest senator, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, in the U.S., said the following, quote, "Military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first use of nuclear weapons." So this is not some outlier outside the establishment. This is at the leadership of the United States Senate. Earlier in the year, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly, there was writing in a U.S. naval journal, the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, said the following, quote, "The U.S. military must shift its principal assumption from nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is a very real possibility. A regional crisis with Russia or with China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons." Now, again, these are the words of Admiral Charles Richard. He's the head of the U.S. Strategic Command. What is the U.S. Strategic Command? It controls our nuclear weapons. It controls global strike. This is the section of the military that would carry out a nuclear war. Now, one of the activities of the Schiller Institute in the last days has been to mobilize denunciations of this homicidal, psychotic madness. And one of the statements we received was from Colonel Richard Black, a former high Pentagon official, who said, in part, "If NATO were to make war against Russia, the chances of escalation into an all-out nuclear conflict would be high." So I want to talk a bit about these three summits that occurred this past week that Dennis referred to. What you've heard about extensively is the 3-hour video conference between Putin and Biden. What you didn't hear about is that just before Putin got on the phone with Biden, he went to India. And what happened there was quite remarkable. Dozens of agreements involving trade, arms, and joint anti-COVID action were agreed upon. Their very close historic relationship, China and India, was reaffirmed in many ways. And very importantly, agreements were signed to use Indian industries in their capability of oil and gas exploration and have them move into Russia's undeveloped Far East. That is, Indian technology integrated with Russian technology to develop the undeveloped sections of Russia. This has tremendous potential, and it is exactly the kind of development that should be the defining characteristic worldwide. Then immediately after the 3-hour meeting, teleconference, between Biden and Putin, there was a hastily called, urgent, and quite poignant conference the same week between President Putin and China's President Xi. They talked about further economic integration. They talked about establishing financial mechanisms of self-defense in case the wild U.S. State Department acts to throw Russia out of the international clearinghouse system for banks, the SWIFT. And very importantly, a presidential advisor to President Putin said, we are talking about the likelihood in the very near term of another summit. This summit would involve Russia, India, and China. And this is, in my view, a most extraordinary development. This is the kind of a combination that Lyndon LaRouche spoke about at great length over the last 20 years. And I'll get to that again in a few minutes. Now, what is Russia's actual role today? Well, it is a nation of science. The Russian Academy of Sciences is one of the great gifts to humanity over the last 300 years. One of Russia's activities today is extending its nuclear expertise in terms of nuclear energy, nuclear medicine to the underdeveloped sector. And I think one of the most extraordinary examples is the Russian development of 4 nuclear power stations on the Mediterranean in Egypt. And what's going on there is that Russia is developing with the Egyptian government a nuclear science university. And also being developed by the Egyptians is a nuclear science high school. So the next generation of young people in Egypt are beginning to be trained in the abundant, cheap energy source of the future, electricity for all of Africa using nuclear power. So this is exemplary and should be reproduced 1,000 times in 1,000 locations across the underdeveloped sector. Of course, Russia is also involved with nuclear science with other nations like Ghana, in which a nuclear medicine facility is being developed. Secondly, Russia is mining coal like nobody's business. President Putin gave an address in Russia a number of months ago in which he said, well, we produce 400 million tons of coal now. We're going to expand it. And our big market is Asia. So we're going to be producing coal at an unprecedented rate, and this is going to power the upshift of the economies throughout Asia. Putin made a joke when he gave the speech, saying that we're definitely not going to go to the way of Texas, where their windmills didn't work out very well. This is when a big part of Texas and the Midwest was freezing in the dark last winter because the windmills froze and didn't work. They also discussed the integration of their 2 economic international extension processes. The Eurasian Economic Union, headed up by Russia, with a series of the Central Asian states, and the well-known Belt and Road Initiative. So rather than this being a competition, they look at it as a synergy of bringing the two nodes of cooperation into close collaboration. This is nothing less than brilliant in a world defined by NATO and the US, where everything is a zero-sum game. Earlier in the year, Russia's leading a think tank which is associated with its foreign ministry, the Russian International Affairs Council, published a report, a 60-page report. The report was called China-Russia Bilateral Cooperation in Africa. And this was a joint piece of work produced jointly by the Russian International Affairs Council and Peking University. And early on in the report, I want to read you one section. They make the following point. They say, "It is impossible to modernize African states successfully without reforming the international economic system and its constituent institutions. A new grand bargain between the global North and the global South is required, primarily serving Africa's interests." Going on, they say, for the international system to transition to a radically new and higher level of global governance, radically new and higher order of global governance. That is, given the current collapsing international financial system, the Bretton Woods system, which has been destroyed over the last many, many decades, a new international system of monetary control and trade has to be set up. Not quite yet Lyndon LaRouche's call for a new Bretton Woods, but very explicitly, the current system doesn't work. And that concept that what's required is not a new law, a new treaty, a new agreement, but a new paradigm, a new definition of international relations with a reaffirmation of the concept of the sovereignty of the nation state, that new paradigm is what's called for. And for those of you who followed President Putin's speeches over the last years, you will recall that in every single speech, he comes to the point where he says, the old neoliberal system in the West is finished. Everyone admits it. The question is, how do we put a new system in place? And indeed, that is the question. And that is the question that Lyndon LaRouche and today Helga LaRouche have been supplying the answer for. A new system based on the principles of Lyndon LaRouche's economic science. Now, let me go back to this question of a three-way summit. This was put forward to the media by Yuri Ushakov, an aide to the Kremlin. And he said that at the summit of Xi and Putin, they said in the immediate future, we intend a three-way summit, China, Russia, India. Now, this is a policy, this is a project, this is a vision which has been in the works for almost 25 years. This is not a new innovation. In 1998, there was a preeminent intellectual in Russia, an academician with the Academy of Sciences by the name of Yevgeny Primakov. He was appointed in 98 to be prime minister. This was in, I believe, August of 98. By December of 98, he was on a trip from Russia to India. And there in India, he made a speech in which he said that we need a new strategic triangle. Russia, India, and China have common interests and can be a great force for good and transformation in the world. Now, this is quite astounding. 1998, in the course of the 90s, Russia lost something over 8 million of its citizens through the genocidal policies coming out of the London School of Economics, out of the United States, out of the shock therapy of people like Jeffrey Sachs, who unfortunately is seen as an expert these days at the United Nations. So Russia was in a debilitated, broken position economically. But because this man of vision, one of the true intellectuals of Russia at the time, was able to, as it were, see into the future, he posed to his great neighbors, China, India, Russia. Who could think of more diverse nations culturally, religiously, historically? He said this strategic triangle is the pathway to a peaceful future. Interestingly, after that, about 7 years after that discussion, in December of '98, China and India were referring to each other as good neighbors and good friends. And by 2012, Beijing said that the India-China relationship is perhaps the most important of the coming century. This reflects the key insight that Lyndon LaRouche has elaborated over decades, paraphrasing the words of Pope Paul VI, that the new name of peace is economic development. Economic development. If you don't have advanced economic development, generalized for all nations, in which rising rates of energy use per capita and energy density at the source of energy production, without that, you will lead to war. So it's quite important, I think, because Putin today has inherited the outlook in physical economy of this Russian genius, Yevgeny Primakov, from about 24 years ago today. And this is what would have to be implemented in order to stop this drive for war, a different type of set of international relations. Now, in 2001, around the same period of Primakov's initiative, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche were invited to Moscow, and they were in Moscow for about a week of meetings. And LaRouche at the time described the special characteristic of Russia. He called it the distinguishing characteristic intention of the Russian people, of the Russian nation. And in a sense, I think importantly, he defined Russia's uniqueness. If you think of a nation as a personality, as an individual character in a world of individual nations of great differences, what is Russia's special character, power? What can it contribute? And I think we have to think this way because, of course, contrary to the absurdities of the war party, as Dennis was laying out clearly, the interests of Russia, the interests of the United States, and the interests of China are completely congruent. If we can have the graphic on the screen, this is Lyndon LaRouche writing in 2001 in a paper called The Legacy of Mendeleev and Vernadsky, The Spirit of Russia's Science. He wrote, "The case of Russia's character as a distinctive Eurasian nation is a case in point. The role which Russia is potentially capable of playing in the currently unfolding history of mankind is the role which should be adduced from the appropriate apprehension of the character of a Russia under distinguishing characteristic intentions. Russia will be able to act effectively as a nation to the degree it is able to direct and sustain its efforts under the governance of a properly selected intention consistent with its personality as a well-defined quality of sovereign nation state. The definition of Russia's role as a nation of science is an essential, integral feature of its nature and efficient historical role as a sovereign nation state personality at this juncture in world history." So it is that Russia which, if America and NATO were to wise up, it is that Russia which we have to and can collaborate with. In this paper, LaRouche emphasized the great Russian contributions to modern science. Mendeleev in the 1800s defining the periodic table, that is the non-living portion of the universe. The abiotic is not a collection of things, but is produced and exists in harmonic relation with itself from the different kinds of elements, oxygen, iron, mercury. They exist in a knowable and in fact harmonic form. Harmonic as in the musical scale. And the conception of Vernadsky, a really world-changing conception of, now is not the time to go into it in detail, of the non-living, the living, and the cognitive or the noetic phase of the universe. Three distinct phase spaces. So what we have to do in the West, NATO, the United States, we have to engage Russia as she really is. We have to engage China as she really is. In 3 years, we'll be at 2024. This will be the 300th anniversary of the founding in Russia of the Russian Academy of Sciences with Peter the Great and the great European genius Gottfried Leibniz. And I have been talking to my Russian friends about the appropriateness in that year, 2024, of holding a quite comprehensive and spectacular exposition of where is science going, what do we have to achieve, with Russia in the lead, with its partners, China, India, the United States, and all the many, many nations of the former colonial sector who are fighting to join the modern world of advanced science and to overcome the genocide, the famine, the enforced poverty, which has been their recent legacy since the attaining of political independence in the 60s. So that's what I wanted to present, and I'm sure Bill has a lot more. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Richard. And if you've just joined us, well, I'm going to welcome you to today's Manhattan Project town meeting entitled Operation Ibn Sina, Carrying the Flag of a New World Paradigm of Peace Through Economic Development. We're going to now go to Bill Jones, China Desk of EIR, and we're going to be talking with him about the Putin-Xi summit in particular and outflanking war hawks with Sanity. Bill?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I think it's quite clear from what has been said that people see that if we get out of the year 2021, we'll be lucky in the year 2021 without some kind of a military conflict between major powers, given the increasing tensions in both the European theater and in the Asian theater. We remember back, or some of us remember back, or from your history books, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was caused at the point that the then Soviet Union was intent on placing missiles 150 miles off the coast of Florida. And of course, that was absolutely unacceptable to the United States. And at that point, there was the danger that we would go to war with the Soviet Union if they did not back off of this very provocative measure. They did, and war was avoided. But if you think back on that and look at what's happening on the Russian front, for example, if Ukraine would be a part of NATO, or even if Ukraine were armed to the extent that some people in Congress are saying, you would have missiles on the Ukrainian soil, which would be directed and could reach central Russia. Similarly, in the Pacific area, if Taiwan became a part of any kind of defensive alliance, the missiles that would be placed there would be about 150 miles off the coast of China, similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what is happening now is that the political elites, the political establishment of the United States is intent on pushing this policy as far as it will go. This is not sleepwalking toward war, because everybody knows what this will lead to. It's more like the lemmings that are moving towards the edge of the cliff knowing full well that there is a cliff there and that if they keep on going, they will fall off that cliff. It's an extremely dangerous situation and demands, as was indicated, as many people as possible begin to voice their concerns very publicly with their congressmen, with political leaders, and with their neighbors about this situation so that we get a general outcry against this type of policy. But why is it happening? Well, it's happening because there are people in the United States, in the political establishment, and in the Western establishment generally, who have a policy that the world must be ruled from the West. That is, that the Western nations, taking the NATO alliance, the EU, and the United States, must set the rules of the road. But what are those rules? And how have they worked? Let's look back at the last couple of decades at what's been happening in the world economy, leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, the major financial blowout from which we have not completely recovered. Countries in the developing sector, Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, have really gone from bad to worse under the dictates of the so-called New York-London financial system, of which, of course, the IMF and even the World Bank are very much a part of. The financial economy has turned into a total bubble, demanding payment from the real economy, meaning that austerity has been implemented worldwide to try and pay back this old debt, which is a result from the financial section becoming a casino economy. And unless something is done to change that, in line with what the Schiller Institute and Lyndon LaRouche during his lifetime had called for, a Glass-Steagall to stop the flow of money into these financial sectors and to concentrate on rebuilding the physical economy, this financial system cannot continue to last and will lead to a destruction of the economies of the West themselves. So that was the system that they want to preserve. Those are the rules of the road that they want to preserve. But those rules have been violated in a very interesting way, particularly with the rise of China, which came into this system essentially without accumulated debt, allowing them to do things that could not be done by many other developing countries who were part of this system. They concentrated as a very poor nation on building their economy. They became really the cheap labor market for the Western economies, but they were intent on not remaining in that situation. Therefore, they placed their emphasis on moving towards science and technology, on finding areas in which they could become preeminent in producing things in order to create a place for themselves in the world economy, not as a cheap labor producer, but as a healthy member of the international economy. And by doing that, of course, they had become, by about the late 1990s, the most important economy in the world, the largest economy in the world, the largest trading economy in the world. And from there, they have only moved forward because of this emphasis. This was also encouraged that they do that by Lyndon LaRouche, who during the 1990s was getting extensive coverage in the Chinese press, and a great deal of interest was shown in his policies, as they had been, as Richard mentioned, in Russia. And they took the lessons to heart, and this has now become the center of their economy, the emphasis on the science and technology. Now, China is a country with approximately over 1.4 billion people. Under any circumstances, a country that size in the world economy would obviously want to have a say in the direction the world would be going. Because they have become a major economic player, one of the most important economic powers in the world, with preeminence in some areas of science, like in the development of high-speed rail, which now is bringing the world together in a way that we haven't seen before. They obviously have a right to demand a say in the direction of where the world's going to go. But because they have been labeled as either a communist country or an autocratic country, they will have no say in the rules of the road, according to the oligarchical leaders in Europe and in the United States. And therefore, because the United States cannot essentially, in the long run, outproduce China. China, as some people have said most recently, probably in the next 10 to 20 years, will have an economy 2 or 3 times the United States. With the emphasis on science and technology, they're going to become leaders in many of these areas. This is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, because the more you develop your science and your technology, the more you can improve the conditions of life in the people of the world. And China has shown very clearly that this is in their interest as well. In 2013, President Xi announced the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of the ideas that had been discussed with the Chinese between the Schiller Institute and the Chinese leadership in the 1990s about creating this kind of a belt or a land bridge between Europe and Asia took its fruition with the proposal of President Xi. And he really went a long way in developing this thing. The amount of high-speed rail that's now encircling the globe, moving into Africa, moving into Southeast Asia, moving into Latin America, is something that we really have not seen. Now, the attitude of the Chinese government is not that they want to become the people who set the rules. In fact, they would like to have an influence in at least formulating the rules so that it is a benefit to the peoples of the world. China has always had a great affinity for, and they were part of, the developing sector. And as they have developed their economy, never lost that commitment. So the activity that they're doing in Africa and also in Latin America has created a tremendous optimism in those countries, giving them an indication that the future may well be bright, in spite of the fact that it's downhill over the last 10 to 20 years. This is something that the United States could live with. This is something the United States used to do itself before we became a rentier economy, living off of our and our ability to produce dollars and outsourcing our industries and sending our productive workers from the steel factories and from the nuclear power plants into working in McDonald's or Starbucks. We've really downed our economy, and we have done exactly the opposite of what Lyndon LaRouche was demanding be done in the 1990s to revive the world economy. So in one sense, the realization by the political strata in the United States that the United States economy has been going to hell in a handbasket was already made known to them in the 1980s by the role of Lyndon LaRouche, who was brutally suppressed by that same oligarchy, and thereby also suppressing a policy that would have avoided the situation that we have today. So because you have that development in China, and I'll get to that, the Russian-China relationship also in a minute, you have this dichotomy between part of the world and part of the political forces in the world who want to push mankind forward, who are opposed, those who are pursuing a policy, a very provocative policy of creating a potential conflict, which could the sake of maintaining the hegemony or the rules of the Western world. So this is the kind of thing that we have to get over in order to try and move things in the right direction. That is, move the world back towards a policy of peace and development. The Chinese, Lyndon LaRouche in his comments talked about the notion of a republic. The official name of China is the People's Republic of China. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that everybody goes out to vote every 4 years and then goes back and hopes that the politicians do the right thing until the next 4 years and maybe they can change something? No, it means something different. There is a total focus on making sure that the people of the nation have a means of life, have the support that they need, have the ability to raise their children, have the ability to avoid sickness and illnesses, and are brought out of poverty. China is the only country that has overcome absolute poverty, and they did it because of the focus of the ruling Chinese Communist Party, which has their interests at heart, which mobilized the forces both within the party and within among the other parties that exist in China to accomplish that goal. This is the way that China works, and it's a little different, of course, as you can imagine, from the United States. But it has created a situation that is just, you'd be awestricken to see the accomplishments that they have made and to compare it with what we have here in the United States. And there's probably many lessons that we can learn. We're not going to adopt the Chinese system. The Chinese are not going to adopt our system. But there are some common goals underneath that. The Chinese are dedicated, the Chinese Communist Party is dedicated to the notion of preserving and maintaining the people's livelihood. Our Constitution calls for the general welfare, that the role of government is the general welfare. We have not been doing as good a job with that as the Chinese have been doing with the people's livelihood. If you look at the situation today in our inner cities and in our farms, and general welfare has largely been forgotten. But it's there. It's there as a principle, and there are people who understand those principles, even among our elected officials, and they have got to be mobilized in the direction of trying to realize the goal of bringing some of our people, or maybe all of our people, out of poverty, so that we have lessons that we can learn. And people were surprised by this. When the Belt and Road was announced, this was the biggest infrastructure development project in the world. Far outshines the Marshall Plan that the U.S. had after World War II, and has created a situation of that where the entire world economy can be transformed, into one in which everybody has a means of livelihood, in which ultimately poverty can be eliminated. But we've got to have the intention of doing that. And at this point, that just doesn't exist. And this focus, this trying to see this People's Republic of China from the point of view of, what people imagined as life under Joseph Stalin, where people were starving and having a difficult time, that's all gone. It's all over. It doesn't exist anymore. And so that those images really should be shunted aside, and we should look at the reality. Within China itself, they do not want a conflict with the United States, nor does Russia. In fact, both of these countries would want to work with the United States as one of their most important partners. And of course, we were important partners at one time. During World War II, we were partners with Stalin's Russia, and we worked very effectively in dealing with fascism in Europe and also in Asia. We were also allied with China, with then the Republic of China, as well as with the Communist Party of China. And we did work with them during World War II to defeat the Japanese. And all of that has been forgotten because of the aura of this Cold War which occurred because of the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Some people are saying, well, we got to have a say in the world economy because after World War II, we were really calling the shots. It's not really the case. What happened after World War II is that Roosevelt wanted to create a new system in which all countries would be independent, in which all countries would be sovereign and could express their sovereign views in the context of an international organization that he himself helped to create, the United Nations. But when he died and Winston Churchill kind of took over Harry Truman, the haberdasher from my own state of Missouri, he launched the Cold War. Russia became an enemy. China, which had been an ally, also became an enemy, and the whole thing really teetered out. And there was a real danger of nuclear war. But when we got out of that situation by the 1970s, the Western countries were prepared to come to agreements, first of all with the then Soviet Union, and also with the People's Republic of China, and that worked very well for a while. But we are going back to the old days now because of the obsession that we have got to call the shots. We had agreements, for instance, with Russia in the OSCE, which was created. It was not the European Union. It was a European organization with participation of the United States, which included Russia. And there were agreements made that Russia is now talking about, going back to, where there would be, while there were still military forces on both sides, there would be an area in which would be a buffer zone. There would not be maneuvers close to each other's borders, and all of this was culminated in sacred agreements with with Europe and the United States in the form of the OSCE, and those all things have been forgotten. This is one of the things, of course, that Russia is trying to reinstitute, so that there would be a pullback of those forces that are now getting closer and closer on the border, and thereby winning a certain amount of breathing space for resolving the overall diplomatic issues, so that they do not lead to war. But the danger is still there, and I think the important thing is to understand what we're facing here, what we're dealing with in terms of Russia and China. The rules of the road, as Richard Black had just mentioned, that were instituted when the Soviet Union fell apart, led to probably one of the worst periods in Russian history, where people were out on the street. And I know that myself in the early 90s when I was in Russia, that they were taking their goods and taking them down to the subway. They were taking their pets down to the subway to try and sell them. In order to get food, they would go out into the fields and pick mushrooms in order to have something for dinner. This was the shock therapy. This was the Western free market system imposed on Russia. And Vladimir Putin, when he became president, he decided enough is enough. And he took the bull by the horns, so to speak, and got Russia back on track to where it had been before. As Richard mentioned, Russian science was always important. During this period, it was having difficult problems because the scientists couldn't get paid. A lot of them went to the United States and to the West, but that also is now being reconstituted. In the Chinese situation, they were never subject in the same way to the Western system, because they came at a late date, and they came with the ability of the government to prevent any kind of mischief by the forces of Western capital. And this is in their very restrictive measures taken with regard to the financial sector, their emphasis on finance being a handmaiden to the physical economy and not being a force in itself. And it's also been indicated by some of the crackdown most recently in some of the bigger firms where people are really trying to make their own views held as the dominant views of the country. But the government is still in control. The government, which is led by the Communist Party, focused solely on the maintaining and improving the conditions of the people, especially in the rural districts, which has always been of importance for the Chinese Communist Party, are really calling the shots. So that any kind of what you might call a Gilded Age, in which the fat cats take over and call the shots, it's not going to happen in China. They will continue working together with the world economy. The opening up remains open, but under restrictions so that the population is not damaged by the excesses that tend to occur in that. They're working together now with Russia, and people are seeing this as a problem, as a danger. But it was really, it caused, in one sense, the worse, the more adamant we get in our aggressive policy towards Russia and China, the closer they're going to get together. But they always have been very close. They're neighbors in fact. They have one of the longest borders in the world, and they have resolved their border disputes. They have always been close. Even during the times of the old Qing dynasty, the Russian Orthodox Church had a place of honor in Beijing, whereas some of the other missionaries, including Matteo Ricci and others, had a more difficult time. The first treaty that was done with foreign powers was the Treaty of Nerchinsk in the 1600s with Russia to define the borders between China and Russia. They were also close, of course, in the initial stages of the People's Republic of China. Remember, we had a boycott against them. Not only that, but we were allied with the forces of the Kuomintang, which had been totally defeated by the communist forces in China, and took refuge in the island of Taiwan, which, instead of thinking twice about it and saying, well, okay, the war is over, now these guys are in charge, let's try and work something out with them. I'm sure they would have been amenable to that. Both Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong had contact with the American military people during World War II. They, in fact, wanted to go to talk to Franklin Roosevelt to explain their position, and that was not allowed because of the political machinations going on by some of the people in the U.S. Delegation in China. But what they did instead is that they took this rump organization that ended up on the island of Taiwan. They proclaimed it the government of China. They were given the seat in the United Nations for many years. And they used that in order to attack the People's Republic of China by, there were various raids by the forces of the KMT, and there were also bombardments of much of the East Coast at that time. So we had that was our attitude towards People's Republic of China, but they did have a friend in the Soviet Union. There was, of course, this ideological connection. People thought it was like a monolith. American intelligence made the biggest mistake in the world by thinking that this was a monolith. And when the Soviet Sino split occurred in 1960, everybody was caught off guard. They had no idea that this was going to happen. But anybody who knew China and who knew Russia knew that this was not a monolith. There were two countries working together, certain ideological affinities, because they were both, led by communist parties, a little different policies, of course, but nevertheless, when they had no other allies, they leaned toward the Soviets. And this was the concept that Mao used. The question is, where are we going to lean after the war? The United States was not an option anymore, so they leaned toward the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviets were very helpful with that science and technological capabilities they had to try and build up the initial industries of China. But when that split came, and there was a whole lot of reasons for that I won't go into, they were all alone, and they really had to work on their own in order to try and rebuild their economies. And there were a lot of mistakes made, and there was a lot of suffering as a result of that, as a result of decisions that were made by this country that then found itself in isolation. But they proceeded apace when the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain signed a treaty of no more testing, atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, I think in 1960 or 61. Mao went to Zhou Enlai and said, we have to have, our nuclear weapons, because if they do this, that means that they're going to be in charge, and we will be, victims of whatever they want to perpetrate. And at that time, of course, the Soviets also were no longer friendly. So that for them, it was a problem. And they introduced a program called 2 bombs and 1 star. That is, the bombs were atomic bomb, a hydrogen bomb. The star was a satellite. And the conditions they worked under were unthinkable. They had slide rules, right? They had pencils, but they had a brain. And they had some knowledge that was acquired also during the period of their cooperation with the Soviet Union. And they did accomplish that, both an atomic bomb, a hydrogen bomb, and a satellite. And it was from those, really, that was the source of the scientific elites of China working under extremely primitive conditions that have now accomplished something nobody else accomplished, going to the far side of the moon. They have now also their own space station up there, and they are fully intent on, by 2030 or thereabouts, of having a lunar exploration station on the moon. Now, all of this is not being done in some kind of hostile way with regard to the West. In fact, they're extending an olive branch. They're inviting people to come and work with them on these projects because they understand that if they work together, if scientists and other experts are able, in medicine and other fields, are able to exchange information, tapping into all the insights that exist within this kind of a context, science would move much more quickly forward. And this is, of course, what they want to do. But given the situation in the United States and the activities of the U.S. Political elites, they are prepared to go it on their own. And they can probably do that too. I mean, look, the fundamental problem is that the United States must understand that the world has changed from the 1970s and the 1980s. We are no longer an individual superpower. And even with our so-called alliances and how close they're going to be and how much the other countries are going to go along with, U.S. policy in this respect is an open question. But even with them, you're dealing with a country of 1.4 billion people, allied very closely with Russia, with its own independent scientific capabilities. They will be able to survive and to move forward, short of war, quite well. And that's what they're intent on doing. This whole discussion of the supply chains and everything like that, where we're going to try and, move out of China, deprive them of technology, change our supply chains from the Chinese market. They will continue on their own in creating their own supply chains. And their situation in doing that is very good because of the tremendous population. The fact of the matter is that short of military conflict, China is going to become a force in the world. And from all we can see of the Belt and Road, of the policies toward Africa, of the policies towards quickly getting vaccines to those parts of the world that are not getting it, to what they are trying to do, and I won't go into that now, but they're spending a lot of time on doing something to relieve the situation in Afghanistan. They can't release funds because that's only the U.S. can do, but they can get aid and assistance to them. Afghanistan for them is extremely important. Afghanistan is a neighbor. And of course, it is a neighbor that at a certain point in time earlier, in which many of these so-called terrorist groups could infiltrate into Xinjiang, and did infiltrate into Xinjiang, causing a lot of havoc. So that having a peaceful Afghanistan, having a prosperous Afghanistan, and a happy Afghanistan would be something that's very important for them, and they're doing a lot with that. This, I think, is the people have got to realize this, that we can work and we should work with Russia and with China, and as Richard Black had mentioned, also with India, which it has a difficult relationship with China, but has a good relationship with Russia. And in the context of the Russia-China cooperation, can probably be brought into that kind of a tripartite agreement in which they also will work together. These become very important countries, one of the most populous groupings in the world, as a matter of fact. Would be very, very significant. And we can work with them because we know all of them. If we would eliminate this obsession that somehow the Chinese and Russians are out to get us. The fact of the matter is that, unfortunately, we're out to get them. And unless we can change that in deed as well as in word, then we're going to be heading for a very difficult period. So that in one sense, it's the decisions that are going to be made over the next few months in the United States and in Western Europe that are going to be very decisive in this respect. That if we can change the policy here, if we can get an understanding of the benefit that the world has with the cooperation of China and Russia, then we're really moving in the direction of a period of tremendous prosperity and development of which the world has not yet seen. But we really have to work hard, get into the Schiller Institute, look at what we have to say, take cognizance of the work that's being done and of the possibilities you might have in helping us move this thing forward. And this is really going to be the key to, what direction the world actually goes in.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill, for what you said, and also Richard. Now, we have a variety of questions. I'm going to try to do something here to put it in a certain kind of both order and continuity. All right, so here is a question, Richard, which is directed to you. How does the Primakov proposal, and I'd like you to repeat that actually because some people have gotten on since we have begun. How does the Primakov proposal concerning a unity between Russia, China, and India relate to defeating the Halford Mackinder idea of geopolitics concerning seizing the Eurasia heartland? Is this a response to that? And is there more to say about Primakov as an individual?
Okay, well, imagine the president of the United States being elected, and he's an extraordinary individual, a great intellect, and has written dozens of books and speaks many, many languages, including Arabic. Imagine one of America's leading scientists becoming the president. Well, that's what happened in Russia with Primakov. His books on understanding the Middle East from a historical perspective are studied in many languages all over the world, inclusive of today. And it was often said that Russia, being part in Europe, part in Asia, is a Eurasian nation. And his insight was that Russia had just been raped repeatedly, again and again and again and again and again in the 90s by what were known then in Russia as the London Boys, all these young so-called economists who were being trained at the London School of Economics in the 80s and 90s for the privatization of Russia, the taking apart of the state, the taking apart of what Primakov brilliantly did was saying the interest of Russian Orthodox Christian Russia, the interest of Confucian Taoist Buddhist China, the interests of India are completely congruent, and this defines the future. This is a beautiful example of what LaRouche means by a first principle, which you can't touch, you can't feel, but it's a principle invisible beyond political processes, which defines a prosperous and happy resolution. So I believe you have the case here of a visionary, a prime minister who is not a politician, but a visionary, steering Russia in its completely debilitated state. The courage, the audacity of saying we three work together around the common image of man, and this defines peace for humanity as a whole. I think that's the size of what Primakov did in as an alternative to the perpetual war machine that Mackinder's sick geopolitical theories of the 1800s were about, which gave us the two world wars. And in fact, I believe that President Putin, as a young president in the early 2000s, inherited that worldview. And you see this in Putin's seemingly infinite patience in dealing with the impudent and homicidally psychotic U.S. State Department, and in opening himself up to this idea of Russia as a Eurasian nation and Eurasia as a force for stability in the world as a whole. And you know, as we've said, China is extending its breakthroughs in science to the entire debilitated, starving former colonial sector. Russia is doing it to a less degree, but I am certainly struck by the fact that the Russian elites are saying we need a new international system in order to implement what needs to be implemented, and that's why Helga LaRouche, a year and a half ago, put forward a proposal that we have a heads of state summit of Russia, China, India, and the United States. And then President Putin, within weeks, picked up that kind of proposal. He couched it in a call for a heads of state summit, a sit-down summit, a grand summit of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And Russia, by the way, keeps bringing this up again and again and again and again. This is not a piece of propaganda. This is a practical proposal. So I think that it's worth, to the question, I would suggest, study who Primakov was, read some of his writings, make sure you're subscribing to EIR, and read the extensive archives we have from the period when he was prime minister and before. Remember, this was a period in the 90s and 2000s where Lyndon LaRouche made many, many trips to Russia. He was an honored guest at the Russian Academy of Sciences, at the Duma, at Moscow State University, at the Vernadsky Institute. Today, many books are written in Russian on economic policy, physical economy, and there are entire chapters on the contributions of Lyndon LaRouche. So these ideas of Primakov, congruent with LaRouche's approach, although not identical, are very much living and steering Russia, including the humorous aspects of, in response to the Green New Deal fraud, the CO2 panic fraud. Putin makes a speech earlier this year saying, "We love coal. we're going to export it like crazy, and we don't intend to freeze in the dark like the Texans.
Okay, very good. So the next question is from Cade, and he asked this. He says, does a Chinese-Russian alliance increase the likelihood of their setting up an alternative to the SWIFT payment situation? SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. And what would that mean for the global economy if they, in fact, set up an alternative? So either one of you, I think, can take that.
Well, let me begin here. If it does come to that, that is, if measures are taken to prevent Russia from using SWIFT as is being that is being said by the NATO troops in relationship to a possible, incursion in Ukraine, that this is the nuclear option that they have economically, then of course they would have to take measures. Look, one of the key things that President Xi said in his recent talk with Putin was that China was interested in maintaining the integrity of that nation, and that is a commitment. Now, what are the implications? Well, of course, if Russia were excluded from the SWIFT, you can be sure that the Chinese would be prepared to do whatever they had to do to shore up Russia. And of course, even up until now, I mean, because of the realization that control over the dollar is also a weapon by the United States to be used in this respect, that a lot of their deals now are simply done in Chinese currency, in the renminbi. And it's also, to a large extent, becoming something of a reserve currency for those countries with whom China is trading. And there have been talks about, replacing the dollar with the RMB. I think is not very high level at this point. But if push came to shove, and Russia, Russia, even without measures against China, if Russia were placed in the situation being deprived of SWIFT, China would work to see to it that the country is not destroyed because of that. And if they would try and eliminate both of these countries from SWIFT, look, the world economy, productively, the physical economy, most of everything is being produced now in Asia, and most specifically in China. How are you going to decouple from that? You try to decouple from that financially, and what is the world left with? It's left with about a third of the physical capacity that now exists. I don't know what the details are, but I do think that if that measure were taken, if they would be so stupid as to move for that nuclear option, you would have two systems working. And some economists are now talking about this. Because there's a danger there. And they're saying that, we have the capacity, with the number of people that we have and the economic might that we have the capacity to work together with other countries independently through a different system if necessary. I don't think that's what they want to do. I think what they want to do is to reform that system, the international system that now exists, because that would be beneficial not only for them, but it would be also beneficial for every other country as well. But we're not there yet, and if they were even more isolated or an attempt to cut them off economically, I think they would work together to create some alternative, and then really all bets are off on how the world will develop at that point.
Okay, Richard, you want to say anything?
Yeah, just that I would say that we should focus on bringing the United States into that four-power relation, as I think the questioner may know that we are doing. In the last couple of weeks, we've had strong outcries, informed expert outcries against this war madness coming from Washington and NATO and London. Tulsi Gabbard Chas Freeman, Graham Fuller, Ambassador Matlock. We need many, 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 many more. What we should have is demonstrations in the streets of the United States for global development and United States in friendship with China and Russia. So as we're thinking about the what if, the U.S. State Department acts in this reckless action, destructive action that you're talking about, we have to focus ourselves on getting the United States on the right path. And just as a thought object, remember, through America's very short history of 240 or so years, for almost the entirety of that history, from 1776, we were close friends with Russia. Russia coming to our aid again and again and again and again. I won't enumerate it. Same thing with China. Benjamin Franklin was reading Confucius in translation and publishing Confucius in his newspapers in Pennsylvania. Through Lincoln, through Sun Yat-sen, who overthrew the Qing dynasty, establishing the Republic of China, his role model was Abraham Lincoln. It would take an hour to go through all the examples. Part of the enemy is the almost unbounded ignorance of the American population. So blame the educational system, blame the school system. But in a sense, when you talk to your friends and you relay what Dennis described, or Bill and myself, about the plausibility of this collaboration, and you get these dumb responses about China's this and Russia's that, it's just complete ignorance. The whole history of the United States has been a history predominantly of collaboration and support between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia. That's the fact.
Okay, we have a question from Kynan. This is to both of you. From what Richard reported on the recent summit with Putin, there seems to be a legitimate attempt by some of the U.S. leadership to actually reverse the drive. I think he means the actual attempt to actually reverse the drive toward the war and work. Oh, I see. Excuse me. Let me just reread the question. It wasn't clear to me. There seems to be a legitimate attempt by some of the U.S. leadership to actually reverse the drive toward war and work to de-escalate the ongoing crisis on the Ukrainian border. I don't believe that people in the United States like President Biden, with the exception of nutcases like Senator Wicker, actually want to start a war based on Ukraine or Taiwan. But they are not attempting to implement the actual solutions to the crisis, as you have just laid out, or as Helga has said with Operation Ibn Sina. So how will we change the prevailing axiom within the United States and the West that it is impossible to cooperate with Russia and China, and that they are attempting to destroy American influence in the world? In part, that's been addressed. Also, I would like Bill to elaborate more on the history of U.S. intelligence with China during the Second World War. Who manipulated Roosevelt's attempts to establish relationships with the Communist Party at that time? Was it inevitable that the nationalists and communists would split and fight one another, or was that also manipulated?
Well, let me just go first on the first thing, and we get to the second one as well. I'll let Richard also comment on this. I'll just note that yesterday, today, the Russians have issued a statement, a draft proposal for what they would want in terms of negotiations with the West, and it includes also this I mentioned before, the pullback and kind of a winding down of the closeness of the military forces, and it also includes that NATO would withdraw from the immediate the countries that are immediately on the border of Russia, and includes also the Baltics as well. That's probably not acceptable, but the reaction has been that the U.S. And NATO has said that we have our concerns too. We will have our draft proposal. Now, the good news is that there are these proposals, and they obviously will lead to some kind of talks. I don't think everybody in the establishment is interested, maybe not, the majority even interested in going to war over these issues, but there is this obsession with regard to Ukraine in particular, that we have got to back them up in what they want to do. The problem is that we had, when the Warsaw Pact, was dismantled and NATO was not, there were these, because countries were involved in NATO and said, well, we've had this pact, so we're going to keep it, but it's not going to be aimed against you. And of course, they advanced all the way to the border of Russia at this point. This created a situation of, really tremendous conflict that everybody knew was going to lead to something unless it were reversed. And of course, with regard to the other countries, the smaller countries on the border of Russia are really obsessed with Russia. You look at Lithuania, and I was working with them when they were trying to get out of the Soviet Union. I thought that's not a bad thing, but these guys have really gone off the deep end, and there's just almost a total obsession with Russia, and they would like everything that they can get, in terms of military hardware, regardless of the overall implications. And the problem with the U.S. and with NATO is that these little guys, with their own specific, peeves, have become a determining force, and that the adults in the room no longer have a say. So that we've been catering to them, and if we do that with Ukraine, and what we got in Ukraine, this is a very a right-wing group of people that took over there. I mean, some of these were allied. Some of the continuity goes back to the alliance of many of these Ukrainian groups, that are now their sons and daughters are there, allied with the Nazis against the Soviet Union. This is not a nice group of people to deal with, and you don't want them calling the shots, or you will go to war. But the question is, can the United States stand up to that? Can Biden, under the present circumstances, stand up to them and to the Congress, which is the worst, even worse, in confronting this? I think there's a willingness there. I don't like using the word cautiously optimistic, because that really doesn't say stuff. But I see a sense of hope in the fact that there is now a basis and a willingness from both sides to try and talk about this. But getting there is going to be more difficult, and I think that requires that we've got to do a lot more in what we can do in explaining this situation to them. I would let Richard answer on that too, and I'll come back to the other question then later.
I would say to Kynan, think of a pot of water that you put on the stove. That's at room temperature. You turn on the heat and you watch it. And for many, many minutes, you can't see anything. I mean, you could set up experiments and know that the heat is being transferred into the water, but you can't see anything. Well, that's sort of like the American political body. There is very little manifestation in terms of outcry. This drive for war is insane. And when you're dealing with the leadership of the State Department, people like Blinken, or this Nazi Victoria Nuland, they are quite psychotic, and tend to go to the brink of war and have a war. And their theory is we can have and win a limited nuclear war. And the boiling water analogy is that we've been organizing and trying to move various sections of the population to agitate, to explode in a boil. But very little can be seen yet. I think what we have to focus on is the maximum we can do in terms of mass saturation in social media, public rallies, demonstrations, letter writing, we have to expand what we're doing, working with many other organizations who do understand we're on the edge of a nuclear war. We don't have enough yet. In terms of anybody in the government that is not that crazy, they're hard to find. The Democrats and Republicans, in a mad fit, fight each other in Congress on every partisan issue. The one issue they completely agree on is maybe we should have a war with China and a war with Russia. This is quite mad. So the situation, I think, has to be looked straight in the eye. The political class in the United States is in trouble, and they're going to get us into a nuclear war. And we have to use our creativity and innovation and flanking ability to move larger sections of the population. This is why Helga LaRouche's call for Operation Ibn Sina is quite brilliant, because chaos in Afghanistan would be devastating for the United States, as well as India, as well as China. And in fact, we do have certain mechanisms like the Troika Plus, which you're probably familiar with, in which the US and China work together with Russia plus Pakistan in order to deal with this pre-war situation. And as Dennis mentioned, leaders of the Schiller Institute this weekend, right now, are leading speakers in the organization of the Islamic Conference, a very major international organization, outlining LaRouche's solution for this very dangerous situation. But in terms of looking for any sanity in the U.S. government today, it's very hard to find. It's that bad.
Bill, before you answer that question, I'm going to throw this in because it's actually in the same vein anyway. And it comes from a questioner from Florida. And they say, I don't understand what we are actually looking at in China. What is the real nature of the Chinese economic system? I know that it is communist, but there seems to be real ownership of private property. Agriculture seems much different than either collectivist agriculture or backward low-yield agriculture. I don't know how it's organized, but I do know that when Nikita Khrushchev, this would be like 1960, I guess, came to America and Vice President Nixon took him around, could have been earlier actually, he showed him washing machines, TVs, and automobiles and other goods, and he said, see what capitalism does? Now people all over China have nearly as much junk as Americans do, or access to it at least. They travel all over the world. So what's really going on? That's the question.
Actually, Bill, let me say something on this, okay. And then you can say, I just want to tell a story. The same question was asked to one of China's leading economists. His name is Justin Lin, and he was giving a lecture in Germany. This was about 2 years ago, and it was a lecture to academics and the media, and the topic was the China miracle. And after his lecture on how the Chinese economy works, various aspects, one of the academics got up and said, Dr. Lin, could you be more explicit for us? What is the relationship between the central government and the building of infrastructure? What role should the private sector play? What role should the government play? So Dr. Lin started laughing and said, well, wait a second, I'm here in Germany. Who we follow in this method is Friedrich List, the great German-American economist who defined very clearly in the early 1800s the absolutely irreplaceable role of the central government in building infrastructure of all kinds to allow private enterprise to proceed. So Dr. Lin, who speaks with great authority, one of the top economists in the government, cited not Marx, not Engels, or Trotsky, or even Mao, but cited Friedrich List, who, for people who studied a bit of history, know his critical role in the shaping of the American system in the U.S. and in Germany. He went back and forth. So that's my story. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, let me just mention this, and Justin is also a very, very good politician. he knows his audiences. But let me just explain. In terms of the World War II situation, we were working together with the communist forces. They were separated from the KMT. There was a whole story around that, but they were an independent force. And Roosevelt felt that one should work with them, and he overcame the objections of Chiang Kai-shek and sent a team to work together with them to assist them radio working and not so much, actually fighting, but they were there and they had these contacts and they had talks with Mao and with Zhou Enlai. And towards the end of the war, of course, there was an attempt to bring the two parties together, but most of the channels, most of the Americans who were working in China at the time, as economists, the OSS and other people, they were very supportive, or at least favorable to the Communist Party, because the Communist Party started fighting when Chiang Kai-shek was still not doing anything, and they were fighting very hard even on their own at the point that the KMT came into the war. And they were also concerned with what was the obvious corruption and deal making that was going on within the government of China at that time. Whereas the communists were considered, and I think were, much more kind of puritanically, you might even say, in some respects, but they were also very much concerned with the situation on the ground, with the situation in the villages. And because of that concern, wherever they went, they would try and set up, structures that, where the people would, have a better life and have easier to move around, and they created a rapport there, which I think became what was called the mandate of heaven during the Civil War, when they seriously defeated the KMT. At the end of that, because they felt that the word was not really getting across to the top people in Washington, including FDR, they made the proposal that both Zhou and Mao would travel, take a plane. Mao had never been on an airplane. I don't think Mao was ever out of China at that time. I don't think he had been in the Soviet Union at that point, which is the only country he visited abroad. But had they done that, who knows what would happen. Barbara Tuchman wrote an article about this in Foreign Policy at one point, how that would have changed the situation. And who knows if it would have happened. Unfortunately, at the time they were doing that, Roosevelt was dying. And, even though the message never got to them, I mean, he was really dead by the time they would have done that. And then they wouldn't really have the person they did want to speak to. But that could have changed the whole thing, because then who knows if the Communist Party would have leaned toward the United States if they felt that it would be beneficial, for rebuilding the country. That's an unopened question. We don't know what that would have led to, but that was the situation during the war era. With regard to the Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, it was a long time in really getting to this point. It was like the famous Chinese saying of, feeling the river by feeling the stones. There was no overall plan laid out. Soviets had a plan and they were doing it. Wasn't related to China with a large peasant population, and their conflicts there maybe partially led to the Sino-Soviet split, as well as other things. But they tried different things. Also, the first step that was taken by people who had experience in the West. Remember, Mao had never gone into the West. He'd never seen it, right? He saw the Soviet Union in a very difficult period, but hadn't seen anything else. These other people, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, had been worker students during World War I, working in French factories in Lyon, I believe it was, or near thereby, and had actually gone. They set up a university for these Chinese workers, and they had worked there, so that they had this experience, they had this knowledge of what was happening in the West, which was, much different than much of the propaganda that was being talked about in the West in these readings. And so that they had this knowledge that this is the way, something that should happen also here in China. So with the death of Mao, and even before that, with the visit of President Nixon, this opened up a lot of things, because as soon as the United States indicated that they would have a relationship with China, and even Kennedy wanted to do that in his second term, it would have been much earlier. But when it did happen, of course, that opened things up, and that meant that a lot of other countries were more amenable to working with China and to talking with them. So you had this interface. And when Deng came to power, Zhou Enlai, really held the fort for the people, what do you say, the forces of progress in the Chinese Communist Party during this awful cultural revolution. And he brought Deng Xiaoping back. He himself was dying of cancer, and he knew it. And he brought Deng Xiaoping back so that he could carry on what he was trying to do, especially with regard to the development of science and technology. And he did that through this reform and opening up, meaning, okay, that foreign, we can have contacts with foreign firms. They can come here, they can invest, they can set up shops. We have our workers here, we have a large working force, they can come and do that. And so that the agreement was that China would become a source of cheap labor for the Western markets. And that was the beginning of reform and opening up. But then, of course, Deng and others had this secondary program that we're not going to remain as cheap labor producers, but we're going to find our niches. We're going to push on the science and technology. We're going to find those areas where we can advance quickly and in moving to a middle income sort of situation rather than being simply cheap labor. And they were successful in doing that. There was, however, this continuity of commitment to the rural population of China, which at the time was majority, was 70–80% of the population. That has never ceased. So you had this opening up, you had firms coming in, and they were still trying to figure out, which way do we go? How do we do this? How do we do that? They added all kinds of Western economists there, including clowns like Milton Friedman. What do we do with our economy? And they experiment. They experiment with a much more, free labor sort of thing, which in the 1980s led to tremendous inflation and to tremendous social unrest. And in addition to operations that were being run by the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the usual forces who were working for color revolution, you had this economic situation, which was a result of moving in the wrong direction there, so that the stop was put on that. And there was a rethinking. I said, what do we do? We want the private enterprise. This is important because individual firms and the like, they can work in a different way and they can come up with new ideas. There's more innovation there. Innovation has to be key. We have to encourage that, but it can't go hog wild. We can't have foreign money coming in here and creating bubbles as they did at that time during the 1980s when there was an opening up. So that they came to this, what Deng called socialism with Chinese characteristic. And it was consistent with that. I don't think that, people simply read Friedrich List or read Alexander Hamilton and said, oh, hey, this is what we want to do. These people were well known, of course, as was List, in particular, Hamilton also to some extent. But it was really feeling their way and seeing the examples in particular of Singapore, of South Korea, and also of Japan, all of which had at that point, and still to some extent, a guiding hand, which was the government, which had the responsibility for the general welfare, so that capital, flight capital could not simply take off and rule the roost. So you've had that dichotomy, and and Karl Marx is read. Xi Jinping also refers to him. Karl Marx has some interesting things to say. I mean, if you studied him, you'd know something about the economy. You just wouldn't know much about innovation and science and technology. And there's an interesting story here because when Deng Xiaoping introduced the opening up, he first had a meeting with the scientists who had been during the revolution, who had been considered part of the bourgeois class, because a lot of them came from, not from peasant families, but from well-to-do families. And so that they were ostracized during the Cultural Revolution and killed and sent out to, the hinterlands. So he wanted to bring them in big time. And so he wanted to say, you are productive forces, just like the working class. You're a part of the productive force. But he had to have Mao, or Mao, not Mao, but you had to have Marx somehow supporting this. And so scholars went through Capital and the theories of surplus value, and it's very hard to find anything there. But there is a section, a small section in the theories of surplus value that talks about innovation and technological development. And so he used that, and said, "Here, this is too. So this is a part of our policy." But it was what they have now is interesting because they are, intent on pushing creative thinking, the aesthetic education, which is something bringing in the arts and the like, which is very important, is extremely important. It's also important that they have this, but also she said at one point, again, he's taking this, 100 flowers should bloom, They want these little firms to exist and to generate new ideas and new thinking. And they're going to encourage this, and they're going to protect it. They're going to do it in the same way that Hamilton did that, give the impetus and the overall thrust so that these private companies can actually do their work. But in terms of the overall direction of the country is going to be determined by the leadership, by the Communist Party, and by other parties do have a say. I mean, people vote in China. People don't realize that. There are other parties in China. The other parties are not really making the decisions, but they are a part of the decision-making process. They are consulted. Their advice is solicited by the party leadership and by people within the party, because what has been made very clear, and especially made very clear by Xi Jinping, is that the only reason we have a communist party is that it's working for the good of the people. And to the extent they don't work for the good of the people, it's no good. I mean, it really says that quite often. So the idea is you have this cadre organization that is motivated by a strong moral commitment to raising the people up, which provides the glue that keeps China together. You might even compare it with the way China has, why it's acceptable in China, why they do it, is that there's a tradition of this, that even during the empire, I mean, this was the controlling entity because of the language, the common language and the like, which maintained the harmony. And to the extent it didn't maintain harmony, it lost the mandate of heaven. And when it lost the mandate of heaven, there was a revolt. And this history is understood. And it's understood also by the Communist Party. And it's made very clear in some of the statements that President Xi made. And you read, I read some of his stuff when he was a mayor, or when he was the head of a province, long before he became so-called the supreme leader. It's the same. Whether he's working in the little village, trying to get things moving, he's got that attitude. We've got to get a better situation. We can do things to make life much better for the people here. And he is inculcating that in the Communist Party as a whole. I mean, it's not always been there. There's been corruption and you have this, especially during the heyday, you had the Gilded Age sort of phenomenon. People had money, and the money became very important. But that's been cracked down on, and I think it's very important because that really creates kind of the moral stature of the nation, which is emphasized at the highest level especially by President Xi. And that makes a big difference because it means that although you have all kinds of scientific developments and people are working freely, batting out new ideas to make things better and to do things quicker and everything like that, you also have a kind of a guardian angel to make sure that, the billionaires, there are more billionaires in China than anywhere else, I guess, and others who have a certain amount of influence because of the power, do not take things off the tracks. And the tracks are the people's livelihood is central. And that's the difference. That's what China is today.
Okay, we have a final question for today, which comes from Jack. I think he's from California. It says, the Orange County newspaper distributed an article that Orange County has set a new record for homeless deaths. 2021 surpassed the previous record set in 2020. What is going on culturally that prevents us from snapping out of this death spiral? It seems our population defends the culture of death and ugliness. In 2019, President Trump told Tucker Carlson that he was thinking about moving federal government into Los Angeles and San Francisco. One of his big mistakes, I think, was not doing that. Not only would he have shown the forgotten man he had not forgotten him, but he would have looked like a genius because COVID-19 was just on the horizon. So that is the comment. And what I'd like you to do, both of you, is to sort of, whether you're responding directly to that or not, use this as the occasion also for final or summary remarks, and then we'll close out. So why don't you go first, Bill, and then we'll go to Richard.
Well, the important thing, I think, to draw on this is that the world is in a very serious situation now, probably more dangerous than anything we've seen, maybe since the Cuban Missile Crisis. People are not thinking straight. They haven't got their heads on straight. And the United States is even worse by the tremendous, surge and dichotomy and problems that have existed over the last few years, which have really torn the nation apart. But somehow we've got to revive the notion in this country of that, on the principles on which this country was really based. And that requires that we do a lot of work on the hustings, and trying to talk to our neighbors, to our friends, working through the Schiller Institute. We've got a network throughout the entire country, which we can rely on for getting out information. We have, the webcasts all the time that should be circulated. We have articles in the EIR and on the Schiller Institute site that should be gotten out as massively as possible, because you've got to have a situation in which the people themselves understand their own really true significance. That this nation is important because it was a nation that had done a lot of good in the world. And we had done that under presidents like Roosevelt, under presidents like Lincoln, also under presidents like John F. Kennedy. And this is a living tradition. People haven't forgotten that. And if we can revise this again, if we can give a sense to Americans of what it means really to be in America, what is this temple of liberty that we had talked so much about, then we would get an understanding of what we actually should do. And we might also have a greater understanding when we regain our own self-confidence in ourselves, of meeting with the other cultures that we have to deal with, which are unlike our own, but which kind of, in many respects, rhyme with our own, and mobilize people to do it. And in that sense, we can begin to try and change this political situation that is existing. But I think it's really a personal appeal to all watching this webcast to think about what you can do, how you can take some of these ideas, some of this material by the Schiller Institute, to make it known to your schools, at your workplaces, in your neighborhoods, to talk about these things and to link up to what we're doing, take part in these events, and maybe even organize events yourself in order to get things moving, because it is required. This has always been what we have done over the past 40 and more years, is to mobilize the population as the means of setting a fire under our politicians, who have, for the most part, gone really haywire on this track, and do whatever we can, because it really depends on all of you, on the efforts of everybody at this critical point in time, to mobilize as if in war, to gather whatever forces you have in order to make it clear to people that we have got to change the way the country is going. And I think that's basically the message I'd like to leave with you all.
Thank you, Bill. Richard?
One of the topics being discussed in China among young people is that in the last couple of years, there have been 4 cold-blooded murders of Chinese students who were visiting students in America, going to universities in California, Illinois, New York. 4 young people who came to America with great hope, wanting to engage in the open and free discussion and investigation and dialogue, which America really is famous for around the world. 4 young students murdered in cold blood. And before this recent period, over the last couple of years, in which this anti-China campaign has been launched by the U.S. intelligence agencies, FBI, the British influence in the United States to divide the U.S. from China. Before this intensified over the last couple of years, it was thousands and thousands of young people, high school students in China, were clamoring to come to America, because America historically was the place where ideas and principles and innovations were discussed, and were discussed openly and freely and boisterously in a university setting. And now that has been absolutely soured because of the downturn in the United States. That has to be reversed. The culture here has become worse decade after decade after decade after the assassinations of Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Each one of them eminent intellectuals and leaders. As many have pointed out, Martin Luther King was destined to become president of the United States if the United States would come to its senses. So this collapse of a commitment to the common good as an internal principle, as an internal passion, a passion for the general welfare, this has to a large extent been lost. And what we have to do, what the commitment of the Schiller Institute is to help people in the United States, in Europe, reclaim that innate, inborn passion for the common good. And if we can do that, which we can do, by spreading understanding, by lifting people up, by immersing people in classical poetry, classical music, if we can do that, then we will become, again, a worthy partner of dialogue with Russia, China, India. But this is an emergency, as Bill just said. And this has been the work of the Schiller Institute over many, many decades. And we've seen from our first introducing the idea of the New Silk Road in 1991, this became a reality. So the ability to take a principle which goes against all of the common beliefs and make that principle become the dominant shared collaboration of the population, this can be done, and that's our mission for today. We have a short-term immediate requirement. This drive for nuclear war must be stopped. Mobilize like your life depends on it. And at the same time, what you will be doing is laying the cultural groundwork for America to reclaim her identity. An America that was led by geniuses like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John Quincy Adams, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These were world historic figures who rightly were seen as leaders all over the world, not as Americans, as leaders for the world as a whole. And that's the identity that all of us, those speaking on the panel, those watching, we are the general staff of that transformation, and that's the task before us.
Thank you very much, Richard Black, Bill Jones. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we, of course, have given you the work that we want you to do. We're going to leave you today, since this may be the last time we see you this year. Next Saturday, of course, will be Christmas Day. And there will not be a program, unless perhaps there will be, but that will just be a Christmas program. But we want to point out the following. 2 days ago would have been the 251st birthday of Ludwig van Beethoven. And we have, those of us in the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute have been commemorating and celebrating that fact. Beethoven was born 250 years ago in 1770. And there have been commemorations and celebrations of this occasion that have happened, although not the ones that people wanted to have because of COVID and the things we all know. There's another 250th birthday that's about to come up, and that is the 250th birthday of this country. Now, technically, if you want to talk about the American Revolution as extending from the time of the Boston Massacre, which was in 1770, we're already in the 250th anniversary. But certainly, for example, on Christmas Day this year, we'll be celebrating the 245th anniversary of Washington's crossing of the Delaware. You know, people tell you these days now don't celebrate Christmas, but just say holidays. And supposedly that has to do with the religious connotations of the holiday. Well, how come people in the United States don't recognize or remember that there's also the day that Washington crossed the Delaware, spearheaded by or shepherded by the Marblehead fishermen, the first integrated military unit in American history. It had Indians, it had Africans, it had African Americans, it had all sorts of people. There was even one person of Jewish faith who was a member of the Marblehead fishermen. Well, not well-known fact, but easily documented fact. And that's something that many people are talking about and writing books about these days, that as people try to encourage people to cancel American history, as opposed to looking at the actual history and recognizing that that crossing of the Delaware, with the slogan at that time of victory or death, at a point at which Washington's army had essentially eroded to nothing. He lost 90% of his forces. He was in a desperate circumstance. And he would hang. And others of the revolution were going to hang, or they were going to win. There was no way to know that they would win. Their crossing of the Delaware at that time was much colder at that time. And then their march 9 or 10 miles to Trenton, and their attack at dawn or after dawn, became the basis for the nation that you're sitting in. And everybody who fought for that revolution, they came from all over the world, is your ancestor. But of course, it's also December. And December, being winter, brings up the end of the year and the close of the year. And also winter connotes the idea of the end, death, and so on. As we all know, it's post-harvest. And so there are many different reasons to think about how one wants to take this year and commemorate it. We thought that it would be useful to point out that Beethoven's own battles against deafness and other forms of problems, political problems as well, didn't allow him the excuse of failure. But failure was not a macho thing. It was a question of being able to be the president of his own mind, that despite the fact that he could not hear, he could compose, and that he composed some of the greatest music ever composed after he could not hear. So that music was not contingent on his being able to hear, because music is not contingent on sound. Sound is a way of conveying music, but music is something that goes beyond that. It's a universal quality. It's a quality embedded in the universe. We thought that the best way to pay tribute to him and to say something about Washington and to say something about the struggle that we're all involved in is to access a performance that was done by the Schiller Institute back in 2018. I think it was November 18th, if I'm not mistaken, that the performance was given. It was done in honor of Schiller's birthday, which was earlier. It was November 10th. And it began with a composition by Johannes Brahms, Dem Dunkeln Schoß der heilen Erde. It's to the holy earth. We commemorate our seed. And it was written, it's from a Schiller poem, The Song of the Bell, but it was written by Brahms to commemorate his great friend, Robert Schumann. And so it begins with that, and sort of the commemoration of an important, powerful, ingenious individual, and musicians basically celebrating one to the other. And then what will happen, as you'll see, is it will transition to Beethoven's choral fantasy by means of a reference to Schiller text. And so we do this in order that we might all think about the actual reason for this season, the intent, as stated in the Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That intention to redeem mankind is an intention that is extendable to all individuals. Yes, it's a religious question, but it is also something greater than a religious question, because there are things that are greater than religious questions. It's a question of being itself and our relationship to being itself, our relationship to the good, an identification with it. And so what we would like to say to you as we close out, in one sense, this year, we will perhaps have a program, but again, it's likely that January 1st will be a first program, that we entrust to you that the words we've spoken and the ideas that we try to put forward all year in terms of the possibilities of Operation Ibn Sina or the other things, the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, or all these other various things, as you saw in the person of Lyndon LaRouche, are supposed to bring to mind the idea of the good. But that idea is entrusted in you. That was the idea of Christmas. And in that regard, that's the idea we believe all people have the birthright to. And we hope that you believe the same thing.
Schiller. When grief gnaws at our hearts, when melancholy poisons our solitary hours, when we are revolted by the world and its affairs, when 1,000 troubles weigh upon our souls and our sensibilities are about to be snuffed out underneath our professional burdens, then the theater takes us in. And within its imaginary world, we dream the real one away. We are given back to ourselves. Our sensibilities are reawakened. Salutary emotions agitate our slumbering nature and set our heart pulsating with greater vigor. Here, the unfortunate, seeing another's grief, can cry out his own. The jolly will be sober, and the secure will grow concerned. The delicate weakling becomes hardened into manhood, and here the first tender emotions are awakened within the barbarian's breast. And then, at last, O nature, what a triumph for you. Nature, so frequently trodden to the ground, so frequently risen from the ashes. When man at last in all districts and regions and classes, with all his chains of fad and fashion cast away, and every bond of destiny rent asunder, when man becomes his brother's brother, with a single, all-embracing sympathy, resolved once again into a single species, forgetting himself and the world, and reapproaching his own heavenly origin. Each takes joy in others' delights, which then, magnified in beauty and strength, are reflected back to him from 100 eyes. And now his bosom has room for a single sentiment. And this is to be truly human.